Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Nina Tannenwald. I'm the director of the International Relations Program here at the Watson Institute. And I'm very pleased today to introduce our speaker, Joe Cirincione. Before I do, let me just say there'll be a few people coming in late. There's a reception, a very quick reception upstairs for David Kurtzer, our colleague here at Brown, who just won a Pulitzer Prize for his book. And so there's kind of a hastily organized reception toast to him. So people will be coming in after that.
Can we go to that?
Yeah. There's wine after you have to earn your wine here. There'll be a reception after this talk to which everybody is invited. So I'm delighted to have Joe Cirincione here. He is president of the Ploughshares Fund, which is a global security foundation, and he is one of the leading internationally known experts on nuclear nonproliferation. I consider him the nuclear explainer par excellence. He can explain anything about nuclear nonproliferation, take any complex agreement or deal, and explain it in a way that's accessible. He has a long background in the policy world in Washington. He worked for 9 years in Congress on the professional staff of the House Armed Services Committee and the Committee on Government Operations. He then served as vice president for national security at the Center for American Progress, and he worked as the head of the Nonproliferation program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I first heard of Joe. I don't think we met then, but I heard about him when I was a graduate student working on my dissertation, which was on a nuclear topic in 1995, when he was the leading voice working for the extension, the indefinite extension of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty in 1995, and then he was again a leading voice in 1996 in the Washington lobbying circles working for the adoption of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And he's been working on these issues ever since. He is the author of numerous books. I have the most recent one here called Nuclear Nightmares. Again, he writes in very accessible style. It's called Nuclear Nightmares, Securing the World Before It's Too Late. He's been very busy on all the talk shows, including the Colbert Report. That was recently. And he's been featured in probably every major publication with op-eds. And so I'm really thrilled to get him here in what is a very busy time. He's been very busy talking about the Iran negotiations. And so, and he's also a Brown parent, class of 2006, yeah, yes. So I'm delighted to have him here. He's going to start by talking about the Iran negotiations and then broaden it to talk about the larger implications of the agreement. So, welcome, Joe.
Thank you. How long do we have, Nina?
Hours.
Hours.
Oh, you can talk right now. 40
Thank you. I'll talk for much less than that. Thank you very much for that gracious and generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be back at Brown. My son, as Nina mentioned, graduated in class of 2006, went on to get his master's degree at Stanford, and is now fulfilling his dream. He majored in education policy while he was here. He's now teaching history at the local high school that he graduated from, and about to be married to another Stanford graduate this August. In addition to my son's successes, the former chairman of my board, Roger Hale, is a graduate of Brown. In 2006, when my son graduated, he led the parade, the graduation parade down your main streets. And my executive director, Philip Young, is a graduate of Brown also. I don't know how I ended up. I couldn't get in. That's why I didn't come here. That's why. I remember now. I went to Boston College instead. I'd like to talk for maybe 25 minutes about the Iran deal and its larger significance, and then open up for questions. And I'm happy to talk about any part of it that you'd like, even if I haven't mentioned it in the talk. Let me just start with something small. U-235. Let me start with the atom that's in contention here. What is this all about? I think it's very helpful to understand what the science is that we're talking about, what the engineering capabilities are that are in dispute. Iran is enriching uranium. It is in trouble for enriching uranium because it started this program secretly in violation of its requirements, its obligations under the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. which says states can do this, but they have to declare it. They have to let the international inspectors know that they're doing it in order that they can ensure that this technology is being used for purely peaceful purposes. When we discovered Iran was enriching this, a number of resolutions were proposed, a number of efforts were proposed to stop it. None succeeded until this moment. What's the fuss about? Iran has uranium mines. And when you mine uranium, when you take it out of the ground, it looks like granite, you can crush it up, and you will find that most of the atoms in that uranium that you mine are called an isotope U-238. Perfectly nice isotope. About less than 1%, 0.7% are U-235. U-235 is the isotope that goes pop. You hit this with a neutron, scientists discovered in 1938, and three remarkable things happen. It splits in two. It forms two other elements, usually krypton and barium. That's interesting. Then that's not gold, so what does it matter? It also splits off two other neutrons coming out. That means if there are other U-235 atoms nearby, those neutrons will hit it, and that will split. And then you'll get 4 and 8, and you see where this is going. That's the chain reaction. That if those atoms are close enough, you can sustain a chain reaction that will allow you to take advantage of the third and most remarkable thing that happens, which is a very small amount of that U-235 is turned into energy. It's a tiny, tiny amount of the atom. But it's enough, for example, the energy produced by one atom undergoing fission is enough to make a grain of sand pop, jump. You could actually see it jump. So one atom out of the approximately 22 quadrillion that are in a grain of sand is enough to make all 22 quadrillion atoms move. That's a lot of energy. And scientists quickly calculated that you had those U-235 atoms close enough together, you could sustain this energy and multiply it millions, billions, quadrillions of times over. And that's what you're trying to do with enrichment. You're trying to get more U-235 atoms closer together. So the way you do that is you take that rock of uranium, you grind it into a powder, you throw away the stuff you don't want, and you're left with pure uranium, and it usually is in the form of a yellow coloring. They call it yellow cake. You take that yellow cake and you bring it to a conversion facility. I happened to visit the Uranium Conversion facility in Isfahan in 2005. You combine it with fluorine, and now you have a gas. It's called uranium hexafluoride. Very corrosive, very toxic. You put that in gigantic containers and you ship it over to the Natanz facility, and there you have the centrifuges. This is where they come in. They're like, the Iranian centrifuges look kind of like a water heater, about that size, a little cooler looking, and they're made of high-strength alloys because they take that uranium gas, put it under pressure, and whip it around at supersonic speed. And when you whip around uranium gas at supersonic speed, as you know, from your experiments in chemistry and biology, the heavier elements go to the outside, the lighter elements remain inside. You can siphon off the inner part of the gas, and now you have a slightly higher ratio of 235. Slightly. So you got to do it again, and again, and again. If you line 10,000 of these suckers up, and you do this for about 2 or 3 months, you can take that rock and that powder and that gas, and you can turn it into not 0.7% U-235, but 3%, 4%, 5%. You can stop right there. You can take out the gas. You can turn the gas into an oxide. You can put the oxide into little pellets. You can line the pellets up into fuel rods. You can put the fuel rods into a fuel bundle, put that into a reactor. You start getting heat, a lot of heat. That heat can turn the water into steam. The steam turns the turbines and electricity. 20% of the electricity in the United States is produced in exactly that way. That's all we're doing, says Iran. We just want what you have. This is the energy of the future. We just want the energy of the future. We want to sell our oil, not burn it for electricity. Extremely inefficient way to make electricity. Do you trust them? Clearly we do not, because of their track record. They have a track record of hiding their nuclear activities. We have a track record of discovering them. We are now trying to ensure that Iran's program just stays at that 3 or 4% level. Because if you keep those centrifuges going for another few months, you can take out of that a gas that's 90% pure. You can turn that into a metal, and you got the core of the Hiroshima bomb. You detonate, about 55 pounds of that. 55 pounds of that uranium produces 15,000 tons of explosive force. You get the ratio. Pounds, tons. That's why nuclear weapons are so unique. Nothing comes close to that kind of power. Nothing. So how do we ensure that Iran is using it for purely peaceful purposes? Ideally, you'd want no enrichment. That was the original clauses in the UN resolutions. They were to suspend all enrichment. That was our original goal. When Iran came to us in 2003, after we had invaded Iraq, and we had about 250,000 soldiers in their neighborhood, they offered us a deal. Let's negotiate the nuclear program. Let's also talk about our relations with Israel. Let's talk about our relations with our Sunni neighbors, our support for Hamas and Hezbollah, and by the way, our relationship with you. Let's talk about all that. They had 164 centrifuges at that time. 164. We weren't interested in negotiating with Iran. Things looked pretty good in Iraq in the summer of 2003. We thought we could roll right over them. We don't negotiate with evil, said Vice President Cheney. We defeat it. And that was the idea. So we rejected the negotiations. We rejected them again in 2005 when they started to sit down with the Europeans and talk, and they then had several hundred centrifuges, working up to 1,000. We rejected them again. We started to slap on sanctions to try to get them to stop this program. The sanctions went into effect. More and more countries joined those sanctions, first under the Bush administration, and then under the Obama administration even more. But during that time, they kept building centrifuges until they got to 20,000, which is what they have now. Now they want to talk. And this is the great tragedy of U.S.-Iran relations. When one country wants to talk, oftentimes the other has not. We now are in alignment. We have governments in both the United States and in Iran where both countries have been willing to talk, and since September 2013, that's exactly what we've been doing. In November of 2013, we reached an interim agreement that froze the program. So for 18 months, the program's been frozen and rolled back in very important dimensions, including they stopped enriching uranium to 20% level, which brought them very close to bomb grade. They stopped enriching to that level and, in fact, eliminated their stockpile of 20% enrichment, pushing them further back, meaning it would take them longer to build a bomb should they decide to go all out and build one. We now have reached a framework agreement, reached just on April 2nd, that meets all of the U.S. goals. This is an agreement that will shrink Iran's program, freeze it, lock it up, and put it under a microscope. We wanted to do three things in these negotiations. We wanted to cut off all the pathways to the bomb, make sure that Iran could not build a bomb if it had decided to do so. The official U.S. intelligence agency's assessment, what they call the National Intelligence Estimate, says that Iran has not yet decided whether to build a bomb. So it's not a program like the Manhattan Project that we had or the Soviets had. It's not a program that's hell-bent on building a bomb. It's a program that's accumulating the technologies that would allow Iran to build a bomb sometime in the future if they should decide to do so. They have not yet decided to do so. So we wanted to make sure that even if they decided to do so, they could not, at least not for a long time. So if the agreement is close to what the framework is, we're in very good shape, because this would roll back Iran's program. It takes the 20,000 centrifuges and it rips out 2/3 of them. They have to be moved into lock boxes, moved into secure facilities where they'd be inspected. The centrifuges wouldn't be dismantled, but the centrifuge cascades would be. They'd be left with 5,000 operating centrifuges. More importantly, their stockpile of uranium gas, the stuff they already have enriched to 5% that could be fed back into the centrifuges to whip it up to bomb grade, that will shrink from 8,000 kilograms to 300. With 8,000 kilograms, they could have put that into their existing centrifuges and produced enough weapons-grade uranium, you now know how that is done, weapons-grade uranium, they could have done that in somewhere between 2 and 3 months. Just these two steps, cutting the number of centrifuges, cutting the gas supply, stretches that timeline out. After this deal is put into effect, if they broke it and tried to sprint to a bomb, it would take them at least 12 months to make enough material for one weapon. That's called the breakout time. That's not actually building the weapon. This is a very conservative estimate. That's just making that 55 pounds worth of uranium for one weapon. Our official estimates are that it would take them another 6 months to 12 months to actually build a weapon, and if you wanted to actually have a warhead that could be put on a missile, that's an additional amount of time. Oh, no, by the way, that doesn't count testing. This breakout scenario is actually quite unrealistic. No country has ever broken out with one bomb's worth. You have to test it. You break out, you have the material, you test it, you got no more material. Usually countries break out like North Korea did with enough for a small arsenal. North Korea has enough for about 6, maybe 8 weapons. US the same. When we detonated our first 2 bombs 70 years ago, we had enough for 3, 4, 5, 6 weapons. So this breakout timeline is very conservative, so a year means that you could catch them if they tried to break out and have time to react, and that was the second objective. How do you catch them? So you've got to put in place a verification mechanism that assures that if they try to creep out or break out or sneak out, you'll see it. This is an incredible verification system on paper so far. Nothing's been signed. This is just the agreed framework to the deal. And it's also the US interpretation of the agreed framework. Iran hasn't said they agree with everything the US has said they'd agreed to. So there's a lot of T's to cross and I's to dot and compromises to reach yet. But this is a verification system that the president was not exaggerating. He said this would be the most intrusive inspection regime ever negotiated. And I think that's true. We get to see all the regular stuff that you get to see under IAEA, plus we go deeper. We're going to track Iran's uranium from the time it leaves the mine to the time it ends up as a gas in those cylinders. We're going to go see things that we have never seen before, the manufacturing facilities for the centrifuges. Where are they making the rotors? Where are they doing this? Meanwhile, the whole program is frozen. They're not allowed to add any more centrifuges. They're not allowed to do significant research on newer versions of centrifuges that would be 50, 100 times more powerful than the ones they have. We're going to set up a special procurement channel, so everything they buy has to come through this channel. Only one other country has ever done this, and this was after they were defeated in war. That's Iraq in 1991. So that means you get to watch everything they buy. So think of the inspections as not as some clumsy Inspector Clouseaus, but as the IRS plus a legion of private detectives who are snooping around, counting, inventory. How many scientists are in this facility? What are you buying for this facility? How many rotors have you made? And tracking it all the way through. So if suddenly 200 scientists don't show up for work at Natanz, where are they? What are they doing? If all of a sudden there's more uranium coming out of the mine than is ending up in the processing, where did it go? So this, you see where I'm going with this. This gives you the ability to take a look at their covert mechanisms to help you detect a suspicious activity that could indicate covert activity. So it helps cut off that route. I forgot to mention, let me go back, there's also another way to make a bomb, and that was the Nagasaki bomb, plutonium core. Plutonium is produced inside reactors. Remember that U-238, the not very useful isotope? It turns out that if you put U-238 in that reactor fuel, in those rods, and you bombard it with neutrons, something magical happens. The U-238 turns some of it into another element. The next element up the elementary scale, named after the next planet in line, so not Uranus, not uranium, but Neptunium, which is very unstable and turns into the next element up the scale, plutonium, named after the former planet. If Iraq was building a research reactor for the production of medical isotopes, other countries do this, allowed under the treaty. Problem is, in operating that reactor, they would produce 8 kilograms worth of plutonium every year. That's enough for 2 bombs. they've agreed under this agreement to destroy the core that they have, to move it out of the reactor and either destroy it or ship it out of the country and put a new core in that's configured in a completely different way. That means that if they run that reactor plus other changes that will be made, they'll produce less than 1 kilogram a year. So you go from 2 bombs worth to not enough for a quarter of a bomb. And to make sure that when that fuel is used up, it's shipped out of the country. So they don't have a chance of extracting the plutonium, and they promise never to build a reprocessing facility, the facility you need to do that extraction. So you've cut off the plutonium route. So where are we? We've cut off the uranium route, we've cut off the plutonium route, we've cut off the covert route, or have a good chance, high confidence we could do this. So what if they do cheat? What's your response mechanism? That was our third objective. You gotta keep together the international coalition that's negotiating this. Remember, this is not a US-Iran agreement. This is the P5+1, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany. You got to keep that coalition together because those are the people that passed the original UN sanctions, because you want to keep together the sanctions regime so that if they cheat, you can catch them and snap those sanctions back on. The deal is that Iran does all these things we want them to do, and we start relieving sanctions. We start giving them access to some of their frozen funds, over $100 billion. We start letting them sell more oil. Their oil supply, their oil sales have been cut in half from 2 million barrels a day to 1 million. We start letting them trade again. We start giving them access to the international financial network. They've been cut off from the so-called SWIFT system. You know, you go to an ATM and you go put your card in and you get money, and maybe it's from a bank halfway around the world. The Iranians can't do that. They can't electronically transfer funds. They've been cut off from that system. Imagine what that does to your trade. This is why they came back to the table. These sanctions were really hurting. So now we're going to, under this deal, we're going to relieve the sanctions. But once you start relieving the sanctions, how are you going to put them back on? You want to make sure there's an elasticity in this, that you can actually snap them back if you can't count them cheating, and that you have enough time in this process to snap them back, or failing that, take other action. That's what this deal promises. That's the structure of the agreement. This agreement was so sweeping and so broad in its scope and so detailed that it caught almost everybody by surprise. And it's no wonder you've seen the core, the center of the American security establishment, come out in cautious favor of this deal, waiting to see how it's finally negotiated. Editorial support across the country, from the New York Times to the Tampa Bay Times to the Los Angeles Times, in favor. Key national security validators like Brent Scowcroft and Zbigniew Brzezinski come out in favor of the deal. Former General Tony Zinni, former Admiral James Fallon, etc. Mike Mullins just came out in favor of it. People you wouldn't expect, like Anthony Kordsman, a scholar at CSIS, in favor of the deal. Bill O'Reilly came out in favor of this deal. Freaking Bill O'Reilly. Why? Because the alternatives to this deal are the collapse of the negotiations, the likely collapse of the sanctions regime, if the U.S. is seen as the reason the deal's not happening, an erosion of the constraints on the Iranian program, and an Iranian program that then goes back into action. Just as they did for the last 10 years, they start building again. They start producing again. There's no limits on what they can do. There's no restraint on their program. And that will bring them very close to a bomb-making capability very soon, and that could bring us very close to war. So as Bill O'Reilly says, nobody wants to go to war. If this is an agreement that is constraining their program, that will stop them from getting a bomb, give it a shot. I would say Bill O'Reilly has accurately summed up the consensus view of this agreement. But there are opponents, abroad and in the United States. The opponents, and this is the political level of this, there tend to be 3 levels of opposition. The first level of opposition is out of genuine concern that these terms aren't tough enough, concern that they're not going to be negotiated well enough. The negotiators are back in Geneva now, this week they're back, and they have a June 30th deadline to finish the agreement. So that's what they want to do. Fine. Questions can be raised. There's some unresolved issues that have to be resolved. I think these are tough. I think it's good to have these questions. I think ultimately they will be resolved. I don't think that's where the fundamental opposition is. You have a political opposition to this. And that is from Republicans in the Congress who do not want to give a Democratic president this victory. This would be, without a doubt, the most significant foreign policy victory of this administration. Some people believe that this agreement could be the most significant foreign policy achievement in over 20 years. You really have to go back to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the agreement that denuclearized Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan to find something this significant. But politics trump national interest in many cases, and there's many, many political figures in Washington who want to deny this president, particularly this president, a victory on anything. On anything. As the saying goes, if President Obama were to walk on the waters of the Potomac, Mitch McConnell would say, "See, he can't swim." So, but I believe ultimately that political opposition can be overcome. I do think there's enough people of goodwill in both parties that you can forge an agreement. Senator Corker, the Republican chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, is an excellent example. Someone who just forged a compromise with the White House last week in passing what's called the Corker-Cardin bill. Ben Cardin, the Democratic senator ranking on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which gives Congress a role in approving this agreement, something the White House fought but then compromised on under the Corker legislation. I think that can prevail. The third level of opposition is ideological, and I want to spend a little time on this because it gets to the broader significance of the deal. If we get this deal with Iran, it's not just solving what many people think as the most urgent proliferation threat in the world. We can quibble about whether that's true or not, but most people think that. It's not just that. I'm doing this. I've been working for 4 years on this. I've led my foundation in investing over $7.5 million in grants to organizations working on this because I see this as the most significant nuclear policy challenge we face, that we cannot make progress on the rest of the nuclear policy agenda until we solve this problem. It is the boulder in the road. You have got to move this out of the way, even though there's no strategic or logical connection between the thousands of nuclear weapons we have, the thousands of nuclear weapons Russia has, and the possibility that Iran might someday get one. Psychologically and politically, there's a huge connection. If you do not get this agreement, if Iran were to be seen as proceeding on a nuclear road, if they were to get a weapon, if other countries in the region were to mimic those efforts, and seek their own weapons, you can forget about reducing the nuclear dangers in the world. They would grow. We really would be face-to-face with nuclear nightmares. In order to get other countries to reduce their nuclear arsenals, you've got to stop Iran from getting one. So that's why I'm focused on this problem. I'm also focused on it because I think it will be the triumph of diplomacy over military force. It is the alternative to the Bush Doctrine, and that is the ideological debate that you will see waged over the next 3 months, 6 months, and continue. As George Shultz says, debates are never settled in Washington. Never. You think you won? What you're seeing is a clash of ideologies, of worldviews about how you solve our problems. The Bush Doctrine, whether it should be named that or not, it's what people call it, put military force as the lead edge of American statecraft. The reason we had no plan for getting out of Iraq is that the people who got us in never wanted to leave. This was supposed to be the beginning of a geopolitical transformation that would go from Baghdad to Damascus to Tehran, maybe even Riyadh. Everybody understood it would be chaotic, but there was a view that this would be a creative chaos, they called it, and that the Iraq War would be the beginning, as Josh Moravchik at the American Enterprise Institute said, of a democratic tsunami that would sweep through the region. This was a fantasy, a deadly fantasy that cost us dearly in treasure, in the lives of our warriors, and in international legitimacy, and it has directly produced the chaos you now see in the Middle East. Obama came in with a very different worldview. And you heard him talk about it in June 2007 in the presidential debate when he was pressed on what he would do. And he said he would go talk to our adversaries. You would go talk to Kim Jong-il, then the leader of North Korea, said yes. He said he would. He would go negotiate with anyone. He was mocked for this. Mocked by his rival, who would later become his Secretary of State. Mocked by his rival, who would later become his vice president. He was called naive by Bill Kristol and the backers of the Iraq War. A dangerous fantasy, they said about this. But this is what he's tried to implement. Remember, in his inaugural speech, he extended the hand of friendship to Iran, offered to negotiate. They weren't ready to negotiate. Their President Ahmadinejad, the Holocaust-denying, rabble-rousing president of Iran then, didn't want to talk to us. He later came around, but it was too late. Hassan Rouhani was elected in June 2013. He wants to talk. I met Mr. Rouhani in Tehran in 2005. He was then the nuclear negotiator. One of his assistants was Mr. Zarif, now the foreign minister. These guys have always wanted to negotiate. They represent not the moderate, not the liberal, not the reformist wing. Those guys have been brought to power and defeated, Mr. Hatami, for example. They're the pragmatists. Rouhani's a regime man. He's a cleric. He wears the turban. He's been a close advisor to Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei for forever. He has his trust. He's on a leash. Khamenei is allowing him to negotiate to see if this works or not. It's not clear that Khamenei has made up his mind yet on whether to accept this deal, but it looks good. It looks like the pragmatists currently in control of the presidency and the foreign policy apparatus of the Iranian government are in control. They want to make a deal, and if they deliver, that consolidates their authority in Iran. If they lose, if they fail, they're toast. They're toast. And the hardliners can sweep back to power. The Revolutionary Guard, the hardliners in Iran who want to kill this deal, who don't want there to be a deal, who don't want sanctions to end because they benefit from sanctions. They control the smuggling operations, who have an autarkic view of what Iran should be like. They don't want engagement with the West. So you have the ideological fight in the United States, you have the ideological fight in Tehran. I think the extremes are been caught a little flat-footed by this sweep of this agreement. I think they're on the defensive now. They're trying to rally opposition to the deal. And it's going to be a fight over the next few months, but I think ultimately the centrist forces in both countries will prevail. So if you invite me back next year, I will talk about how this deal is going, how it's being implemented, what it means that we're opening up an interest section in Tehran, what it means that U.S. businessmen are going not just in small delegations, but in large delegations, what it means that Iran is now cooperating with us on other areas of strategic interest. And this is the last point I'm going to make, and it's the big game. It's the big game. Talked a little longer, but I want to tell you just one last story. I had dinner with President Rouhani when he came in September of 2013. It was a small group, about 25 Americans, heads of foundations, former U.S. officials, Republicans and Democrats. And one of the former, and we peppered him with some tough questions. And one of those questions, it's from Richard Haas, head of the Council on Foreign Relations. He pressed the president on why we were just talking about the nuclear deal. There were many more issues, much more important issues. Why don't we go big for big, as it's called, big for big? And let's talk about the relations with Israel. Let's talk about the Sunni-Arab rivalries. Let's talk about support for Allah. Let's talk about human rights. The whole thing, put it all together. And Rouhani says in Farsi, he understands English, but he speaks in Farsi, the history of U.S.-Iranian relations is very complex. The table cannot bear the weight of all these issues at once. I love the way these people talk. We have to take one step and build confidence that we can take the next two, and so on and so on. And both sides have agreed to start with the nuclear. This was September 2013. We actually hadn't started talks yet. We didn't know, we now know, that there were secret talks going on with Bill Burns, the Undersecretary of State, and Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor to the Vice President, now Hillary Clinton's Chief Foreign Policy Advisor. And those, they really had agreed to start with this. Now look, we shouldn't get carried away with this. We're never going to be BFFs with Iran. There's never going to be an alliance here, but that's not the aim. And this is the bigger picture. As Rouhani says, we have to learn to manage our differences. Interesting verb. Not resolve, not overcome, manage. The way we managed them with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The way we managed them with China during the Cold War. And maybe that will lead to cooperation on other areas of strategic interest, like stabilizing Afghanistan, which both the United States and Iran want to do, like defeating ISIS, which both the United States and Iran want to do, like stabilizing Iraq, like ending the conflict in Syria, which both Iran and the US want to do, for their own strategic interest. Not because we're friends, not because one side's doing the other, overlapping strategic objectives. We're still going to have differences. Look at Yemen. But we can manage these differences. They don't have to lead to war. They don't have to lead to a nuclear bomb. Those are the stakes that I see in these Iran negotiations, and why I'm investing so much of my time, and I thank you for investing a little bit of yours. Thank you very much. I completely lied about how long I was going to talk, but let's take some questions, and I'll try to keep my answers short. Oh, we do?
Yep.
Oh, I have a few other things to say. Oh. Go.
Yes, I was at your Providence Council on Foreign Relations talk about in 2011, I believe. I was about 12 years old, and I'm 16, going on 17 now.
I remember you.
Yeah. Smart-ass kid.
Wilson?
Will.
Will, okay, Will.
So I you
Smart-ass
mentioned,
kid. Where are you? Where do you go to school?
I go to Paul Coffey High School.
Oh, high school.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you mentioned the 1993 or 1994 Memorandum that got rid of Ukraine's nuclear arsenal, who
Yeah.
at the time had the third biggest nuclear arsenal in the world. Now, of course, that memorandum guaranteed Ukraine's national sovereignty. You know, the United States,
Yeah.
Russia, Germany, etc. But you mentioned that the Iranian negotiations is the boulder in the road. But is this memorandum that happened in 1994 the other boulder, given that Ukraine's national sovereignty has very much been violated over the past year?
I serve on the Secretary of State's International Security Advisory Board, although the views I express are purely my own, don't represent the board or the department or the secretary, and they're always happy to hear me say that. And we looked, right before Russia's invasion, we started a study on U.S.-Russia relations and how we thought they could be improved, and they were kind of stuck. Then the invasion happened, and they tanked. They're the worst that they've been since Russia reemerged from the ashes of the Soviet Union. We will never recognize Crimea's annexation by Russia, but we may have to live with it. We are struggling to find a way to make sure this conflict doesn't spread, that it doesn't get more militarized, that more people don't die, that Russia doesn't threaten other nations, and that their violation of a principle that has held since the end of World War II, that one European nation will not use force to change the borders of another European nation, is not repeated. And that's what's at stake with Ukraine. This is about much more than a few thousand kilometers of land. This is about a principle that has kept the peace in Europe longer than anything else has kept the peace in the history of Europe. Their period of peace and prosperity since the end of World War II was unprecedented. So there are big stakes in Ukraine, but they're not these stakes. They're not this. Is it a huge issue? Yes. Is there a chance of resolving that anytime soon? No. What we're basically looking for is containing it, buying time, waiting. If you look at the application of the Obama Doctrine to Ukraine, I would say you're seeing the use of the other instruments of U.S. power. We are much more than a military power. We're an economic power. We're a diplomatic power. We're the ultimate guarantor of European security and the independence. Ukraine is not a member of our security alliance, but neighboring countries are, and we are seeking to reassure them that should the same thing happen to Lithuania or Estonia, fairly new allies, that there will be a military response. But I think the measured course that we've taken here, not to escalate the crisis, to wait out Putin, to put sanctions on him, to isolate him, has a chance of success. A chance of success. It's been aided greatly by the drop in oil prices, which has greatly weakened Putin's hand. The oil was triple what it is now when he invaded. Triple. He's in trouble. He's in trouble. Stakes are high, but not these stakes. Yes, sir.
Twice in your dissertation, you used the word in relation to sanctions, snapping back.
Yeah.
As a former banker and not very knowledgeable on sanctions, but everything I've read said that that metaphor may be inaccurate. It takes a long time to put them on. There's a huge amount of negotiations that have to go on to get the international banking community to basically shut stuff down. Doesn't sound like snapback is the right way to describe it.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'll defer to you because you're
No.
an expert.
No, you guys put your finger on something. All of us have had to learn about centrifuges and SWOs. We're soon going to have to learn about correspondent banking, right?
Yes.
I don't know what that is. I just learned the term last week. And it's this mechanism that you're talking about. So there's two things. One, they're trying to keep the mechanism intact, the mechanism that took so long, and now just waive the sanctions, which is what the president is saying we want to do with Congress. Doesn't want Congress to vote on lifting sanctions now. You don't want to do that. Keep the mechanism in place. He's got the executive authority to waive sanctions. He could actually remove sanctions that he imposed by executive order. That's one class. But the congressional sanctions, they have a national security clause that allow the president to waive them. That's what he says he wants to do. And then let's revisit that in 2 or 3 years and see if Iran's complied, and we want to then lift them. But even so, that's one level. And so even so, the longer you have lifted or waived these sanctions, the harder it is. I think of it as an elasticity. At some point, there just isn't a lot of snap left. And so you're right, and that's a risk that people are running, and that is the key point that's being negotiated now in Geneva. What is the pacing and sequence of sanctions relief? And where's the compromise on that one? People think there are creative compromises. Iran wants them lifted permanently right away. As soon as they sign the document, they want them lifted. Well, no way are we going to do that. What if as soon as they implement the agreement, the core is removed, the centrifuges are gone, then put a relief. Everything they do is reversible. So you want to make sure that everything we do is reversible too. And it's hard to put centrifuges back. It's hard to put sanctions back. And you want to have enough time so that you can respond to a flagrant violation. There will undoubtedly be areas on the edges. Every agreement has this. Everybody interprets it strictly from their point of view, and you think they go over the line. That's not really what you're worried about, and a mechanism will be set up for that. It's the blatant breakout. These guys are going for a bomb. What are we going to do about it? There are risks in this deal. What wins the day on this deal are that the risks associated with this path are far less than the risks associated with the other two alternatives, which is to allow an unconstrained Iranian program or go to war, a war that would make the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan look like warm-up acts. Sir.
I'd like to hear your thoughts on what you think could be done if the deal doesn't get resolved and hardliners either in Washington and or in Tehran block it. How would you see the prospects for managing things from that point on?
They're grim. They're grim. I tell you, I don't know if the Iranians are positioning on this or they really mean it. Mr. Rouhani was asked about this by one of my colleagues, and he said, "Well, you know, we'll continue. We'll try to find a way. We'll try to get it." I think he's putting an optimistic spin on this, because if we don't get an agreement, Rouhani's political future is over. He's done. He has much more to lose by not getting agreement than the president. It's hard to see a path for continuing. You hear some people suggest a path. Lindsey Graham says that any other future president could negotiate a better deal than this president. Hillary Clinton could negotiate a better deal. Ted Cruz could negotiate a better deal. He obviously thinks he could negotiate a better deal. So what he wants is to kick the can down the road, to keep the interim agreement in place, keep the sanctions in place, and push the whole thing off until 2017. That's a fantasy. That's what we call the unicorn option. It doesn't exist. There's no such thing. You can't do that. You know, it's like riding a bike. Either these negotiations are moving forward or they collapse. So there is not a good plan B. You can imagine things, but, and this is actually one of the reasons I'm optimistic that we're going to get a deal. I would say the chances of a deal are around 90% right now, absent any external factors, such as a conflict in the Gulf of Aden. Absent anything like that, I think they're going to resolve it because all the countries have decided they want this deal, and they can see ways to get it. They can see the compromises. I think that's those underlying drivers. And no one can see what to do if you don't get it. There's more to say, but let me keep my answers a little shorter.
First, thank you for that fabulous, Professor Tanawal was right. Your explanation of that got through.
Thank you.
It was
Very kind.
fabulous, even to lay people. In your opening few sentences, you talked about, do we trust them?
Yeah.
And I think that's a big question that critics are putting forth. Could you give us your take on the reports that, what is it, IAEA, that only one out of the 12 inspection requirements have been allowed for the United Nations, have been allowed by Iran's government?
It's slightly different. Let me explain the
Okay.
situation. Are they living up to their requirements under the interim agreement? Have they frozen the program? Have they reduced their stockpiles? Have they allowed inspectors in? The answer to that is yes, and the IAEA just issued a new report last week saying they have fulfilled every term. And where there were some questions, there were some experiments with new model centrifuges, for example, they resolved them. They stopped the experiments. They get high marks for that. So they're doing everything they're supposed to do. The question comes up on the past history. The IAEA wants to have a clear, and we do too, want to have a good understanding of what Iran did in the past. And there are these 12 issue areas to address. And Iran has given us satisfactory answers on only one. So that's the issue. It's called PMD, Programs of Past Military Dimensions. Thank you. Possible military dimensions, PMD. And I actually think this is the hardest problem to solve. Because although the evidence is largely circumstantial, I think it's overwhelming that Iran did in the past do research or some experiments on nuclear weapons. Strictly forbidden by the NPT. Unlike the enrichment that's not forbidden, but you're just supposed to declare it, you're not supposed to do any of that stuff that we think they did. So now they're in a tough situation. Do they admit that they did this? They have resolutely denied it. Absolutely not, Rouhani says. Never, says Zarif. Don't even ask, says Khamenei. No. But we think they did. So what you basically have to do is construct an off-ramp. Give them a face-saving way of admitting this, of coming clean on this. Fortunately, we have a lot of experience in doing this with countries that help them admit, like South Africa or even South Korea, other countries that have conducted experiments they weren't supposed to be conducting. But I think it's going to be one of the last things to be resolved, and the framework agreement is setting up a mechanism for doing that. So you can't make that a prerequisite to a deal. It has to be the result of a deal. Once you've gotten the stuff that you're really worried about, I mean, when you think about it, are we more worried about things they may have done 20 years ago or what they're going to do now and may do 20 years in the future? So you put the most important stuff first, and then you clean it up. You want answers, and you want to have a mechanism, and some of the sanctions relief is going to be tied to the answers. And this is the question of trust, because I mean, I look at their answers, and I think they're flat out lying. I don't trust them for a minute. I have some colleagues who insist, no, there are innocent explanations for this. I just personally don't buy it. I think they did it, and at some point they got to come clean. Yes, sir.
What do you think Israel's role is going to be in all this?
Mr. Netanyahu wants to kill the deal. I don't think the national security, military, and intelligence apparatus of Israel wants to kill the deal. So I think you see a political split in Israel. Israelis, been to Israel? My family lives in Israel. My mother-in-law lives in Israel. My sister-in-law lives in Israel. I give them the spiel that I gave you. They say, yeah, we don't trust him. You know, so even the Labor Party doesn't trust him. But inside the family, lots of differences, lots of disagreements, lots of disputes. Mr. Netanyahu is not a particularly popular man. I mean, he barely won the election. We've had former defense and intelligence heads criticize Mr. Netanyahu for saying Iran was an existential threat. That diminishes Israel's security, they say, that underestimates our capability. There's nothing Iran can do to us that we can't answer or deter, including having a nuclear weapon, says Meir Dagan, the former head of Mossad. I think you're going to hear more of those voices. The problem you have right now is that Mr. Netanyahu is using his influence with what some people call pro-Israel organizations. I think of them as pro-Likud organizations in the United States, like AIPAC, have a very conservative view, who are trying to kill the legislation, trying to prevent the negotiations from succeeding. So it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a challenge. Fortunately, there's this pro-Israel, pro-peace organizations like J Street and who are working on the other side. You take a poll of Jewish American voters, and it's overwhelmingly in favor of making a deal with Iran. 61% favor, no, 68% favor of making a deal with Iran. So you'll see this played out, and I think the key here is to make sure that in the course of this deal, you're addressing Israel's genuine security interests, that you make sure that nothing in this deal lessens Israel's security. Even though you and the Prime Minister may have a different view of what that security is, you try to reassure them that should this deal go sour, the U.S. is still going to be there, the U.S. is still going to protect you, and we will indeed take action against Iran should they try to sprint to a bomb. But it's probably the key issue in the political discourse that you'll see around this deal is, what does this mean for Israel? Sir.
The United Nations going to be the organization that does
First.
the verification? Do we trust them? Do we feel confident that they can manage this process to a degree that
So,
we can feel comfortable?
sure. I'm sorry I called you twice. I won't do that again. Quickly, remember, the P5, the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, all of whom have nuclear weapons, by the way, are doing these negotiations. So almost, built in is that you're going to have UN Security Council support for this deal. In fact, that's probably the first thing that will happen. The first sanctions that will be relieved will be through a new UN Security Council resolution that will revisit and restructure all the existing UN Security Council resolutions on Iran. The mechanism for inspection is the International Atomic Energy Agency, headed up by Mr. Amano. I was just at a conference with Mr. Amano, talked with him a few weeks ago. Were you there at the Carnegie Conference? And he said that he thought that the IAEA could detect any discrepancy in Iran the day it happens, the following day, or within a week. Many experts, as Nina knows, will dispute that. They're not that good, but that's what he says. The deal is supposed to give them enhanced capabilities. The interim deal already has doubled the number of IAEA inspectors in the country and given them daily access, whereas previously they went every 2 weeks. So you're already seeing this happen. When I say we're going to put this program under a microscope, I mean more than the UN. because we're going to be looking over the UN's shoulders. And when I say us, I mean our national intelligence apparatus. Iran is probably the most surveilled country in the world right now. And if we don't see something, the Israelis may be seeing it. If the Israelis aren't seeing it, maybe the Germans are seeing it, or the French are seeing it. Everybody is examining Iran. So I think in the end, there are going to be questions, there are going to be issues, but you're going to have a fairly high confidence that you can detect major violations of this agreement. In the back, sir.
So given what you just said, like the surveillance capabilities of the U.S. and Israel, do you think the United States would put military action ahead of just letting Iran actually develop a bomb and letting it balance with Israel and sort of, like, do you find that that is a
I think the
priority
political
over-
pressures to take military action in the face of a major Iranian violation would be enormous. Enormous. A Congress that won't declare war on ISIS would support military action against Iran.
Would or wouldn't?
Would. I know. Come on, ISIS. We can beat ISIS. We actually cannot beat Iran. This is a major country. This is 80 million people. This is a heavy military. The Quds Force, an element of the Revolutionary Guard, makes Al-Qaeda look like amateurs. You think they got regional influence? They're going to use that regional influence. You think they have an international network? They're going to use that international network. You like your oil going through the Straits of Hormuz? Don't get used to it. I mean, this would be a major war, which is why I don't know any military leader who thinks that the military option is a good one, who supports it, who wants it to go, who so cavalierly addresses this the way Senator Cotton does. A couple of days, maybe a week, he says. A couple of days, maybe a week. The man doesn't know what he's talking about. You ask any military leader, and they'll tell you what a war with Iran would look like. It would be the biggest war we fought since Vietnam. And you can't win this with air power. Tony Zinni will tell you, if you bomb Iran, you set the program back a year, 2 years. Former Secretary Gates said maybe 3 at the most. But shut it down, you need boots on the ground to shut it down, and we're not going to invade another Middle East country. As Gates said, if anybody suggests another major land war in Asia, tell them to have their head examined. So that means that Iran would be set back, and then it would be pedal to the metal. Debate over building a bomb would be over. The decision would be made. They could probably sprint to a bomb. They'd get a bomb 2 years, 3 years after that. And what are you going to do? The Israelis say you have to keep mowing the grass. You have to go back and do it again. Really? That's your option? That's your plan for dealing with Iran? So even though I think there would be strong support for military action, I think the military leaders of this country would be very, very hesitant to undertake it. I personally would rather contain a nuclear Iran than fight one. That's what we've done with every other nuclear threat. This debate happened in 1964 when China was going to test a bomb. The Joint Chiefs recommended bombing China to stop the test. We didn't do it. And that, talk about a revolutionary, expansionist, crazy ideological regime. Maoist China in 64. We contained it. Follow up quick?
So what would you say about fears of like regional proliferation and possible?
2 quick answers. There's an excellent study done on this. So the myth, I used to teach this. I used to be a nuclear cascadist. I think I did it. I had charts here showing Iran gets a nuclear bomb, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey will feel they have to match it. North Korea gets a nuclear bomb, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan would feel they have to match it. Well, every once in a while, your theorists have to actually pay attention to what the hell happens in the world. North Korea got a nuclear bomb in 2006. Does South Korea have a nuclear bomb? Did Japan go nuclear? Taiwan go nuclear? All these countries could do it. Japan could build a nuclear bomb in 3 months. None of them went nuclear. Why not? Turns out there's a lot of barriers to going nuclear. A lot of technical, economic, security, alliance, diplomatic barriers that can be brought into play to convince countries not to follow that option. Security assurances, military alliances. One of my colleagues, Colin Cowell, wrote an excellent report on this, if you want to go into this, called Atomic Kingdom, on whether Saudi Arabia would go build a bomb if Iran did, and he concluded no, they would not. He ruled out Egypt for basically economic and technological reasons, and he ruled out Turkey basically for NATO alliance reasons. But it's a very thoughtful study, and he is now the National Security Advisor to the Vice President of the United States and deeply involved in these negotiations. Read Atomic Kingdom. Yes. No. Yes.
Great.
I'm coming back to you, Will.
Thanks for that last bit. That answered one of my 3 questions. I'll try to be brief. I may ambush you later with some more questions,
Sure.
if that's all right. But one, years ago, you had some language about we can't leave Iran a screwdriver away
Yes.
from a bomb, and this and
Yes.
kind of how uranium enrichment at all, could be fed back, and that could produce a bomb. So, as you said before at the beginning, ideally, no uranium enrichment is the move. But why did you change that stance? I'm assuming because you think the framework agreement, the 3 goals that we set up are enough. And then, but if there are other reasons, please talk about them. And then
No, hold that point. So
Okay.
let me deal with that.
Yes,
Okay,
please.
ready?
Yes.
So that was in 2005, and this was when Iran was negotiating with the EU3. This is France and United Kingdom and Germany. Thank you. In fact, they called the P5+1 the EU 3+3. So, and we didn't join the talks. So Iran, they were able, at that time, Iran had, I'm trying to remember, I think it might have been 600 centrifuges. And I'm a proliferation hawk. I was running the Carnegie Nonproliferation program at the time. I did not want anybody to have enrichment capability. I don't want Japan to have enrichment capability. I don't want Brazil to have enrichment capability. You don't need it. You don't need to make your own fuel. If you have a nuclear reactor, you can buy the fuel. That's what almost every country does. In fact, one of the things that we're suspicious about is Iran's insistence that because it has a nuclear reactor, and it does have the only nuclear power reactor in the Middle East, that it has to be able to make its own fuel. That doesn't make any sense. There's no economic sense to this. You have to have 15, 20 reactors before it makes economic sense for a country to do their own enrichment. South Korea has, do you know offhand? I think they have about 15, 20 reactors. South Korea wants to do its own enrichment. They just signed a deal with the United States that says they will not do enrichment. That's what you want, because you don't want to leave countries a screwdriver's turn, and that's what I meant. They could have the capability, build up an industrial capability, and one day decide, like Japan could, they want to go build a bomb. That was my position. Hold it. That was the position. Zero enrichment for Iran. I agreed with that. 0, 0. I had 2005, 2006, 2007. The negotiations break down. They don't happen. It's clear that Iran will not agree to 0. So what do? Do you hold your position that's pure, that's true, but you cannot achieve? Or do you adapt? You adapt. You try to reach a compromise that will contain the program, And that's what I did. And it turns out that's what Mr. Netanyahu did just a few months ago, because he was saying 0, 0, 0. And just right after and even if you read closely his speech to Congress, he talks about a small program. And he's clarified since then that they can be allowed a small program. I think there is a deal that Mr. Netanyahu would support. It's just not a deal we can get. But it's a deal that would not be 0. It's not going to raise their program and salt the earth. We're not Rome, they're not Carthage. But it's a program that can shrink it. He would like to go down to 3,000, 4,000 centrifuges, more restrictions, more things. But he's in the ballpark, and that's why I changed. One other anecdote about this change in position was used by my conservative opponents to attack me in a rag called the Free Beacon, which I hope none of you read, but it's an online publication. And fortunately, I was in the company of Hillary Clinton, who was attacked 2 or 3 times in articles that day, and Barbara Lee, who was attacked, and Mr. Obama, who was attacked, and that's what they do. So he says, prominent U.S. nonproliferation specialist switches position to please Obama administration, because I changed my view. And I was critical now of the 0 option. So this may be why this came to your attention.
Yeah, that's exactly what I read.
If you Google Cirincione, this is one of the articles that come out. I don't know what algorithms these guys use to pop this thing up to the top. By the way, if you also Google nuclear Colbert, you get me. So if you get a chance afterwards, go Google nuclear Colbert. You can see my 6-minute interview with him, which is one of the funniest things I've ever done, and also the toughest interview I ever did in my life.
The second part was, as we look forward to the specifics of the deal, what should we be looking out for? Are there any red lines that we should be aware of that would be flags for you?
I would say, well, since the toughest issue is sanctions, you want to preserve as much elasticity in the sanctions as possible. I mean, I don't trust Iran. There's got to be a stick in there that, maybe the carrots are big enough, but you can't trust that. So there's got to be a stick in there. So I think you do have to look very carefully at the sanctions part. Look carefully at the verification. There's this issue of sometimes called anywhere, anytime inspections or surprise inspections. They're not really that, but our ability to go to suspicious sites. A Revolutionary Guard commander just this week or last week said, no way, they're never coming to a military site. Now, the leader of the country didn't say that. Mr. Rouhani didn't say that. Our negotiators didn't say that. Their negotiators didn't say that. It was a Revolutionary Guard commander. I think that's sort of the equivalent of Tom Cotton talking. Well, maybe a little more authority than that. But I think Iran is posturing right now. You can see both sides posturing, but that's an area I'll be looking at. They're going to have to let us go to suspicious sites. One of the other key issues, one of the toughest ones, I don't want to call this a red line, but it's the issue of advanced centrifuges. See, the beauty of this deal is that these guys are stuck with 1970 centrifuges. These things that we're arguing about, these are the AQ Khan Model 1. I'm not kidding. This is where Iran got its centrifuges from Pakistan. If it wasn't for Pakistan, we wouldn't be worried about an Iranian nuclear program. They bought it all from AQ Khan originally. Now they started building, their smart people have started building their own, and they have this, what they call, we used to call it a P1, now they call it an IR1. Well, they have an IR2 model, a 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 that are much more modern. They're really 50, 100 times more powerful. You do not want them swapping out these 1970s technology for current technology. And one of the things you have to worry about is it's 15 years out. In the framework, it's 15 years out. So the deal buys you 15 years, but then what? How do you have to be worried about that. And that is a genuine concern. And this is what Mr. Netanyahu talks about. When he says it paves their way to a bomb, that's not true, but it does open up this future possibility that in 15 years Iran would be treated more or less like a normal country, the NPT, and be able to buy more or less any technology they want. And they could then go to an industrial scale enrichment facility and could end up like Japan. I don't know why I keep looking over here. Is anybody Japanese over here? Go ahead. So those are some of the things I'd be worried about. Yes, sir.
What's the risk for the deal if a rightist president gets elected in either country in the next elections?
Right. So let's say we get a deal, because I think if there's no delaying this, either this thing happens or it doesn't. I mean, it's very hard to see a scenario where it's dragged out in negotiations people, you're going to have to do it or not do it. Do not try, do. So, but if Tom Cotton is elected president, or Ted Cruz is elected president, or Marco Rubio is elected president, the letter of the 47 senators said that president could revoke this agreement. That substantially underestimates the historic tradition of executives in this country. presidents do not lightly overturn agreements that have been reached by their predecessors. I'm sure there's some, I can't really think of them, and when they do try to do it, it's very hard. President Bush, for example, opted out of the ABM treaty. That was a huge fight. It started when Ronald Reagan wanted to do it in the 80s. It shows you how hard it is to change something that is largely seen as in the U.S. national security interest, and I think a deal with Iran by 2017 would be seen as working. Many of the people who oppose this deal oppose the interim agreement reached 18 months ago, which they now all agree is a good deal. Lindsey Graham wants to keep this agreement that he hated 18 months ago and tried to kill. Obamacare, another example. Hate it, repeal it. Really? So I think that the merits of this agreement are so strong that it'd be very hard for a conservative president to overturn it. And in fact, it might be easier to win acceptance of it. It turns out conservative presidents, particularly Republican presidents, are much better at arms control arrangements than Democrats are, because they have the support of the Republican Party. They have at least half of the party that's with them, and they have all the Democrats that are with them, so it really leaves a small, isolated group, which is why most of the arms control agreements that have actually reduced our nuclear arsenal have been negotiated by Republicans. Nixon went to China, you know. Ronald Reagan made the deal with Gorbachev that cut the U.S. nuclear arsenal in half. So once this deal is made, if we had a Republican president now, we would have had this deal with Iran a long time ago. I'm not kidding. It's the politics and the ideology that are blocking this, not the national security merits.
Can I just follow up?
Go.
I mean, it seems to me that once you get business interests involved, right, there's a deal. I mean, for people who want this deal to stick, it seems to me we would want, say, Halliburton to go in, right, and start doing a lot of business there, because if there's a Republican president in next, it'll be much harder to undo it once you get a lot of business interests involved, right?
It does, and this leads to the gentleman's question back there, is once you get a lot of business interests involved, it gets real hard to put sanctions back on. But the opposite is also, it also becomes real hard for Iran to break out. I mean, that's part of the theory, is that these ties, and if either you believe in liberal democracy or you don't, and these kinds of exchanges can change a country. And this kind of freeing up of the entrepreneurial spirit of Iran can change the country, which is why human rights activists in Iran are in favor of this deal. They don't care about the nuclear program one way or the other. What they care about is human rights for Iran, and they believe that this is an opening that will lead to other reforms that Mr. Rouhani promised but has not yet delivered. That was part of his program that will bring Iran back into the world. That's why when Mr. Zarif landed in Tehran on April 3rd, he was mobbed by supporters. There's huge public support for this in Iran, not because it's preserving the nuclear program, it's because it's changing the country, or it's the step that they see will change the country, which is exactly why the hardliners are against it. They don't want to see this at all. So that's, I know most about the American fight, but there is a huge struggle inside Iran as well.
On the question of sanctions, I think the devil really is in the detail, and I think that the snapback, particularly in the context of the P5 politics and the Security Council, is going to be difficult. So, and I look forward to talking to you some more about that. But I wanted you to respond to what critics are using.
So let me suggest you bring Elizabeth Rosenberg up here from the Center for New American Security. She was with the Treasury Department and put a lot of these sanctions on.
Do sanctions here at the Watson Institute.
Oh, well, I'm sorry, never mind. Thank you very much.
But I wanted you to respond to the comparison that people make to criticize the deal in terms of you can't trust them, in terms of DPRK. And because a lot of conservatives are throwing that out and saying, see, it doesn't work, you can't trust them, et cetera. So I want you to respond to that. But then I also want you to talk a little bit in terms of what are the lessons and implications for the long term of the nonproliferation regime?
Yes,
because here
thank
you
you.
have Iran and you have
Yeah.
DPRK, both of who embarked on this process. And now Iran gets to keep elements of its programs, and
Yeah.
you still are maintaining to other countries that they shouldn't be.
So my friend Bob Gallucci, who negotiated the agreed framework, and Joel Witt, who was assistant, just wrote an article in the New York Times, I think, on the false arguments that are being made. Max Boot, who knows nothing about North Korea, wrote an article in Foreign Affairs disputing this. I just was in exchanges with Joel today, urging him to rebut this argument, this Max Boot article, because we want to have this debate. Conservatives won this debate based on a false history of what happened with North Korea. The common view, I would say, among people in this room, is that the North Korean deal failed, that they cheated and they got the better of us, took advantage of us, and Iran and North Korea had no intention of giving up its nuclear program and was always just buying time until they could sprint out and build the bomb, which they did. That is completely untrue. That is not at all what happened. The program successfully froze Iran's plutonium program for 8 years. 8 years. They were ready to give up more. They were ready to give up more. We couldn't quite seal the deal. One of the things that screwed up the agreement was that we didn't fulfill the terms. In exchange for North Korea doing this, we were supposed to give them 2 light water reactors, help them build light water reactors. You talk to Bill Perry, who was negotiating this, we had no intention of giving them light water reactors. We never thought the regime would last that long. So one of the lessons he draws out of this is never count on regime collapse. Never. Look at Cuba. Never count on regime collapse. And then the Congress cut off oil supplies that we were supposed to deliver to them. So the North Koreans then started pulling back. Were they also cheating on it, independent of everything we were doing? It seems that they were. We froze the plutonium program, but they were cheating on the uranium program. And when we confronted them with that, I think it was 2003, when we confronted them with that, to our surprise, the North Koreans admitted that they were cheated and offered to bring that into the negotiations and negotiate what they would do, what constraints they would take on the uranium program. The U.S., in my view, then walked away from the agreement because the Bush administration never liked the agreement and never wanted to keep it. There was a split in the Bush administration, I think I write about it in this book, between the pro-engagement forces led by Colin Powell, who wanted to continue the process of negotiations started by Bill Clinton, he said in his first press conference as Secretary of State, and the forces led by Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney and Mr. Bolton, who never wanted to make any kind of agreement, didn't trust it, and wanted to do regime change in North Korea. That was their answer. So in my view, that's why the agreement unraveled, and why they then, under the Bush administration policy, proceeded to march and build a nuclear weapon, and detonated in 2006, and then detonate another one, and then start building more long-range missiles, all of which had been frozen under the previous agreement. That's that. Implications for the Nonproliferation Treaty. People talk about countries like Iran and North Korea, but there are no countries like Iran and North Korea. There's only Iran and North Korea. There's nobody else with programs remotely of this scale, of this commitment. North Korea has now crossed the nuclear threshold, has enough material for 6 nuclear weapons, may be on the verge of building many more. Iran is developing capability, but is not there. If you can get a deal with Iran that turns them away from this, that ensures you for 10, 15, 20, 25 years that they're not going to build a bomb, that's a huge shift. If you then provide a model for a plan that could, approach that could be used for North Korea, including demonstrating to countries like North Korea that you actually can make a deal with the United States that we will keep, you can then start looking, and I have a chapter in my book about this, at the end of proliferation, at the end of this wave that began 70 years ago in Hiroshima, because the truth is there are not more and more countries getting nuclear weapons. There are fewer and fewer. There are fewer countries now with nuclear weapons than there were 30 years ago. More countries have given up nuclear weapons and nuclear programs than have tried to acquire them in those last 30 years. You're always going to have the problem of the dual-use technology. If you have reactors, if you have enrichment facilities, you have the capability of building a nuclear weapon. But the determined effort to make a bomb, to go for a bomb, to seek the security and prestige that you think a bomb's going to give you, you could really talk about rolling this back. And this will be a huge gain for the Nonproliferation Treaty. And if you just to think of the reverse, not getting this deal, what this would mean for the Nonproliferation Treaty, and how greatly weakened it would be. I would say if there's any chance for this Nonproliferation Treaty Review Conference that's about to start in May, next week, any chance for success, it'll be buoyed up by the prospects of getting this deal. It didn't come in time to get it, but it'll be buoyed up by that. So, and for the reasons I explained, the Nonproliferation Treaty has two parts: stop new countries from getting it, stop countries from building more, and help get them to reduce the weapons. I think this deal with Iran could revitalize the entire nuclear disarmament enterprise, which is currently moribund. We have time for a few more questions. I'm going to stop sharply at 5:30, correct? Will.
One quick question. You were talking about how Iran and the United States have overlapping security interests in the Middle East. But these security interests are often conflicting. So how would we, going forward, assuming this deal passes, and as you said, 90% of the time.
I'm quite optimistic we're going to get
So yeah,
this.
if it passes, and we end up negotiating about other things, how do we address Iran's differing security goals, given that we've known that, for example, Quds Force has been aiding, or was aiding, Shia militia groups in Iraq like the Mahdi Army, or supplying the Taliban or Hezbollah? How do we reconcile that?
I think we're going to continue to have a rivalry with Iran, even an adversarial relationship in many of these areas. But we did with the Soviet Union, and we did with China. When Nixon went to China in 1972, 20 years earlier, just 20 years earlier, the Chinese Red Army had killed tens of thousands of American soldiers. They were still arming the North Vietnamese army that in 1971 had killed 2,300 U.S. soldiers, and would continue to arm this. So you got to understand this. Nixon is engaging, toasting a man who's responsible for the deaths of thousands of Americans. What Red China did pales in comparison to the sins of Iran. So if we can manage that and work out our relationships and reassure a very small, vulnerable ally on the border of China, Taiwan, that we would assure their independence and security, I think we can manage Iran. I think we can manage the differences that will occur and forge a new, broader strategic framework. I actually think it's this strategic framework, this engagement that we could have with Iran, the possibility it holds out for providing some stability in what I believe is going to be a chaotic region for decades to come, is one of the things that's going to sell this deal. Because most of the national security establishment doesn't really care about the nuclear program one way or the other, but they do care about this, and they do care about regional stability. And there are many people who are already looking towards this. Ellen Laipson, the president of the Stimson Center, just wrote an excellent article on this in the national interest and the possibilities. The administration doesn't want to talk about this, and they shouldn't, because they would look too pie in the sky. They'd be accused of selling out U.S. interest in the nuclear agreement in order to grab this larger bone. And they shouldn't. This should be judged, as far as they're concerned, strictly on its national security merits. But there are many other people looking at this broader picture and already thinking about how to manage conflicting objectives with Iran. Last question, Nina? Yes, sir. Go.
Oh, great. Kind of similar to Will's question. With sanctions relief, will we be empowering Iran to continue funding state terrorism around the world, and will that cause more destabilization than people worrying about?
The argument goes, they're going to get tens of billions of dollars in relief. That means they'll have more money to fund Hamas and Hezbollah and Shia militia, etc. During the time that their economy has collapsed, during the time that their oil sales were cut in half and the value of the rial, their currency, fell by 60%, they didn't drop their support for terrorist groups 1 rial. They kept it, they cut it out, and they were willing to allow living standards to drop while they kept that support. So the existing policy of sanctions and isolation hasn't cut their support for those groups. With new resources, would they have? Yeah, I think that's a theoretical, I think that's true. I don't see any way that they wouldn't have more resources. Would they necessarily increase them? I don't know. I think that calculation is not one that's made on resources, but is made on strategic interest. Does it work for them to do that? You know? I mean, there's a simplistic view, for example, that the civil war that's now raging in Yemen is because of Iran expansionism in the region, that Iran is on the march and it put the Houthis up to this. I think anybody knows anything about Yemen knows that isn't true, that there are internal factors that are doing this. Does Iran have an influence? Are they aiding? Are they this Shia group? Yeah, and that's why Saudi Arabia is intervening on the other side. But is that determining what's happening? Is that what really caused the former dictator to block with the Houthis to try to seize power from the man who overthrew him? No, I don't think it is. So I think the calculations that Iran will make on its aid to Hamas and Hezbollah and Houthis and Shia militia are independent of the new resource, or relatively independent from the new resources they will get. It'll be a factor, but it won't be a determining factor. Yes,
So
ma'am.
May I ask the last question?
Yes, you may.
Okay. So the question is, there are several models out there, and the question is, what lessons will other countries learn? So one, I want to go back to the very first question here. The lesson of Ukraine, that they gave up their nuclear weapons and they got invaded by Russia. So one lesson countries could learn is that they shouldn't give up your nuclear weapons. A second lesson from the Iran agreement is that you can get pretty far with the international community before you have to deal with this action. So Iran is, in fact, the turn of the screwdriver away, right? They're willing to live with all these monitoring and so on, but they basically got what they wanted. So one lesson there is you can get pretty far with the international community because it takes a long time to get P5 agreement to do anything. If you look at the series of Security Council resolutions that didn't do anything for a long time, it took years before the Security Council put on its first resolution on Iran. So it's a long, long time, and in that time, as you know, they got, 30,000 centrifuges, right? 20,000, whatever they are. And then the third possible lesson is that it is so costly to do what Iran has done, that the cost, the focus, the scrutiny of Iran, the delegitimization, the pariah status, everything makes it way too costly to go down this road, and that any other country contemplating doing what Iran has tried to do would be deterred because of the now precedent set by this very intrusive and extensive agreement and negotiation. So which lesson do countries learn?
I don't see a lot of countries that want to be Iran, that like the model of Iran, that would do this. If a country, one of the lessons that you didn't mention is if a country wants to build a nuclear weapon, it will build a nuclear weapon. And there's not a lot you can do about it. Governments are willing to have their people eat grass, as the head of Pakistan said at the time. Look at North Korea. Who are these people to build a nuclear weapon? But they did it. And they put up years of isolation. No country in history has been coerced into giving up a nuclear weapon or a nuclear weapons program. 70 years. And believe me, we have tried. Others have tried. No country in history has been coerced into giving up a program, but lots of countries have been convinced to do so. And those countries are models of what happens. Argentina and Brazil used to have nuclear weapons. They were in a rivalry. Brazil had a test shaft dug to test. Gave up the programs. Forged a treaty, the Treaty of Tlatelolco. You know you're a non-proliferation specialist when you can say the Treaty of Tlatelolco. Well, all of South America is nuclear free. South Africa gave up a program on the eve of apartheid rule. I mean, apartheid rule was ending and going to majority rule. The key is that Nelson Mandela didn't reverse that decision. He could have been the first black nation with a nuclear bomb. He decided they were better off without it. And I think history has proven that historic precedent to be right. It's true that Iran has gotten far and been determined, and it takes the international community a long time to respond. But the cost to Iran, I really do think that that's the dominant lesson, that this is, you can do this, but it's really gonna cost you. Do you really wanna be Pakistan? Do you wanna be North Korea? Do you wanna be Iran? I'll tell you what I think the Iranians want. It's what Mr. Rouhani said to us at dinner in September. He said that he thinks that within 30 years, Iran could be the 10th most powerful economic power in the world. And I think a lot of experts agree with him. This is a rich country, 80 million people, well-educated. They have an industrial base. Iran builds cars, the only country in the Middle East. They make about 1 million cars a year. Fifth of the world's oil reserves, a quarter of the world's natural gas reserves. Actually a booming effort on solar power. Yeah. But in order to get there, you got to get out of the sanctions. In order to get out of the sanctions, you have to give up the nuclear program. I think that economic power is what the center of Iran's establishment is after, not the illusion of power that nuclear weapons give you. And if that plays out, I like that path. I like that lesson. I want Iran to be engaged with the world, whatever their religion, whatever their form of government, and participating in regional solutions, not isolated, not threatening, not a problem. There's no guarantee that cooperating with Iran or seeking agreement with Iran will get you a resolution of the difficult problems of the Middle East, including an Israeli-Palestinian peace. But not having Iran engaged pretty much guarantees that you won't get a resolution of any of those problems. That's the bigger game afoot right now. It's the one that is going to be very much in play over the next few months. It's not very often that you get to see the hinge of history move. We may be at such a moment. Watch this space. Thank you very much for letting me come and talk to you. Thank you.